We're here on page Chav Daled, and I guess you would call it maybe we're up to the fifth paragraph, Machsheva Shalol Lishma. But first, just backtrack because we ended the shir with Shimon Achi Azariah, and he had a distinction between what's called Namuch and what's called Gavoah. So first, we'll read the words as Shimon Achi Azariah formulated them. Im shachat karban namuch l'shem gavoa mimenu ein zu machshava poselos ach im choshav bekarban gavoa l'shem namuch is a karban nifsal legam. So we want to understand how to categorize namuch versus gavoa. We have two notes on the bottom, Tov Nun Zayin and Tov Nun Ches. In the first note, quoting a Gemara in Zvachim on Daf Yud Aleph, we have a case of Namuch L'Shem Gavoa, and the Gemara vacillates in this case of Namuch L'Shem Gavoa. Is it absolutely kosher, which means it's Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chova, or is it kosher, but it's not Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chova? If I assume that according to Shimon Achi Azariah, it's Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chova, then he's disagreeing with the previous Tana on two counts. Number one, the previous Tana says that even if it was Namuch L'Gavoa, it's possible, whereas Shimon Achi Azariah says it's kosher. Number two, he's also adding another element to the equation, and he's saying that it's Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chov. They don't even have to replace the carbon with a second carbon. The other side of the Gemara is that Ba'ofen Zeh, in the case of Namuch L'Shem Gavoa, even Shimon ben Azariah would agree that although the carbon is kosher in Namuch L'Shem Gavoa, nevertheless it's Eino Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chov. Now, we said in the past that there are two exceptions in which the Machshava Shalol Lishma passes the carbon complete. That's Pesach and Chatos. What would be, according to Shimon Achi Azariah, in Pesach and Chatos, in a case of Chished L'Shem Gavoa Mihen? Again, we don't know exactly what Gavoa would mean in general, and certainly we don't know what it means vis-a-vis Pesach and Chatos. Well, let's assume that Ola is Gavoa Michatos. That means, relatively speaking, Chatos is Namuch vis-a-vis Ola, because Ola is Kulo Kolil. It could be possible, therefore, this is the Karanora, that according to Shimon Achi Azariah, in a case we had a machshava in a chatos l'shem ola, which would mean namuch l'shem gavoa, maybe in that case the carbon would be kosher, according to Shimon Achi Azariah. Now we move on to the next footnote, which is Tov Nun Ches. How do you classify a carbon as either namuch or gavoa? Kodshim is called gavoa. And if he had in mind the machshava l'shem kodshim kalim, that's called l'shem namuch. Kodshim have a kedusha chamura vis-a-vis kodshim kalim. Kodshim kalim can be eaten even outside the azara, whereas kodshim have to be eaten in the azara. Now let's reverse it. Let's say he was shechting a carbon that was kodshim kalim and he had in mind l'shem kodshim, that's called namuch l'shem gavah, which according to Shimon Achi Azaria does not passel the carbon, and it's possible that even it's ol l'shem bailah. Now he adds another thing. He says, Kodshim kalim atzmam, even within the structure of Kodshim kalim, you can break it down into two subcategories of namuch and gavah. So it's not an absolute distinction between Kodshim and Kodshim kalim, but it's a relative distinction that can apply to any two karbanos, even if they belong to the same category. For example, if we compare shlomim to bechar and masa, shlomim are considered gavoah vis-a-vis bechar masa, which are considered namuch. And why is that so? Shlomim zrikas domam nases b'matan shtayim sheina arba, which means that in the case of shlomim, we need two matanos. Each matana on a corner of the mizbeach. So he covers in that keret both sides of the mizbeach. Bechor and meiser, all you need is matana achas. Furthermore, shlomim requires smicha, nisachim, nufas chazav v'shov. Bechor and meiser do not require neither smicha, nor nisachim, nor tnufa. This is pretty fascinating that you could have within shlomim a breakdown of gavoah and namuch, where shlomim is kodshim kalim, but nevertheless it still retains its status as gavoah vis-a-vis bechar and maser. So if you have a machshava at the time of the shechita maser or bechar, the Shem Shlamim, that would be mina nomach legavah, and that would be kosher according to Shimon Achi Azari, but not the reverse. Now let's break down the concept of Shalol Lishma Poseles into two. We have Shinui Kodesh and we have Shinui Bailim, right? We spoke about L'Shem Zevach and L'Shem Zover. So in the case of L'Shem Zevach, he had in mind, the Kohen HaOved, at the time of his avodah, that instead of shechting shlomim, for the sake of shlomim, he's shechting it l'shem chatos. And again, even though it's mina nomach ela gavoah, but we're not accepting Shimon Achi Azaria, and that would be a machshava poselas. If he had in mind, in the case of a chatos for any other carbon, that would passel the carbon because of the special status of chatos and pesach. But here he had in mind, in the case of a shlomim with shem chatos, which is from namuch to gavoah, and yet it passes the carbon according to the chachamim who never accepted Shimon Achi Azari. And that's called shinui in l'shem zevach. Now we get to shinui in shem zover. And he had in mind at the time of the Zrika, again, we'll see about other avodos later on, that he's being zorek for the sake of a different bailing. Instead of the Shem Ruven, who's the owner of the carbon, he had in mind the Shem Shimon. Hishev ha'oved, the Kohen HaOved, b'shas Zrikas Shlomim, of Ruvain, shu zorik es adam l'shem Shimon. Now, this doesn't touch at all on the issue of Korban Pesach. In Korban Pesach, it's much more complicated because there's a chabura, and they are all money on the Korban Pesach. Let's say he had in mind for the sake of someone who's not manu, that itself might be another case of shinui bailim. Now, chishev bezrika atzma l'shem bailim acher, Tosas sheet is ein zu machsheva shinui bailim. The ein machsheva shinui bailim elam chishev bavodas acheros halvanas lizra. Mamish wild. You hear this? If he has in mind at the time of the shechita, etc., that the zrika should be l'shem Shimon instead of l'shem Ruvain, that's called a machsheva shinui bailim haposel. But if at the moment of the zrika you had in mind the wrong bailim, that's not a machsheva poseleth. Why not? I would say b'kal v'chomer. If other avodas l'shem zrika for Shimon is possible, then how much more so if the zrika itself was l'shem Shimon? So just to try to make some sense out of it. I don't expect any magical miracles here, but what you could say is that all the other avodos are preliminary. They're sort of like what we call in modern Hebrew a keresh kfitza. Are you with me on that? You know, it's like a propelling, like a diving board, to get to Zrika. Zrika is the culmination. The Zrika itself, which is the essence of the kapara, that generates its own lishma, inherent in the Zrika. The machshevas hakohen is not relevant. It doesn't register. It doesn't make any impact. Not positive and not even negative. It's a total zero. Not on the radar screen. Because the Zrika itself, as the culmination of the kapara of the carbon, inherently belongs to the Bible. I mean, there's no Zrika for anyone other than Reuven. I mean, to set up a relation between the Zrika of the carbon and Shimon is ridiculous. But what kapara does Shimon have in this carbon? What relationship does he have to this carbon? Once the dam, it's a din of the chefts of the dam, not the Maisa Zrika of the Kohen. Now let's take a look for a moment. Maybe Steve, you don't mind closing the door if I can trouble you. Let's take a look at Tov Samach. He has a Gemara in Zvachim Adaf Dalet with regard to a carbon sibur. Is there shini bailim in a carbon sibur? Bilchora, the bailim includes everyone. So how could you have a shibur? Kolat sibur ema bailim. So if he has in mind Shimon, Shimon is a bailim by definition. It's a carbon sibur, belongs to the entire bailim. But what happens if he has a machshav l'shem nachri, a non-Jew? I mean, he's not part of the tzibur. He ain't no bailim in carbon tzibur. So l'chora, intuitively, you would say for sure, hands down, that's a machshav shini bailim, even in the case of a carbon tzibur, and it's poselis. No, it's not. Why? L'fisha ein ha-nachri mechuyav kapara kamosa. And this, again, is similar to what we discussed earlier about Zrika. The Zrika, which is the Maisa Machaper, is not related to Shimon, but Shimon doesn't have any shaykhs to this kapara. So, too, in the case of a carbon sibur, if you have the same nachri, I mean, you could say, well, I'm shechting the carbon sibur l'shem an elephant. So that's going to be a machshava shinui. Shinui means you got the wrong violence. But the kapara theoretically could have been relevant to that person. He's not the bailim, that's called the shini aposelis. But in the case of a nachri, that's not a shini aposelis. He's mufka completely. He's not in the constellation of that kapara. It reminds me again, I don't know if it's a fair analogy, but if you don't mind, let's backtrack to Pigul, right? We said that a machshavas Pigul, it means that every other part of the avodah was done properly. So let's say, for example, he had in mind at the time the shechita and the kabbalah and the halacha l'shem, one day of achila. And then he got to the zrika, and he has in mind 2 days of achila. And it's a korban chatas, right? So that's called a machshavas Pigul. But if already the korban was possible for whatever reason, when he got to the zrika, that's not a Pigul. Now, it's on one level, it's counterintuitive, but what it's telling us is that sometimes a machshava poselet has to be within the confines and in the league of hechsher HaKarban. He messed up, obviously, and it's a machshava poseles, but all the elements of the equation were there. But sometimes when you stretch your arm out to a machshava that's outside of the league, that doesn't register at all. But if that in theory, he could have shared the same chiv kapara. Let's go on. Chishev v'achsheva shalom l'shma b'karbana she'enim nifsolim b'kach. Tzarich lahamshich es shar ha'avodos b'machsheves l'shma. So let's say we're not talking about a chatos or a korban pesach, and maybe a machshava shalom l'shma does not passel the korban, but he's got to continue the avodos l'shma. There's got to be something that links up this korban, some avoda, call it one single avoda, that is l'shma. Ubi ofen zeh, this is a sugya in Tzvach Madav Zayid, ein dai sheyase shar avodas pistama. As if he had a machshava of shalol l'shma, then with regard to the other avodas, the balance of the avoda, a stama l'shma would not suffice. So if lachshel beheja, he needs a positive kavanah intention l'shem korban, because now he has to salvage the korban and be machshir the korban. For that, he needs a machshava l'shem hakorban, l'shem hazeva. And this is the chiddush of the Chafetz Chaim in Likutei Halachos. And we say the kol osal das rishonu osam v'yaseh b'stama harezik moshe chishe b'shar avodas es machshavta rishonu shelo lishma. So he began his avodah with a stama. And now we're going to apply the principle that kol osal das rishonu osam, but a das rishonu was not a das. He did it stama without anything in his mind, no intention whatsoever. So therefore, as far as the other avodas are concerned, it's basically shalom l'shma. So when we say that a korban shalom l'shma is kosher, we have to have some other avoda that's l'shma. Yesh mi shekosav she'im chishev ba'avoda achas machsheves shini bailim yochol lachshov b'shar avodas l'shem bailim acher. So he's got Reuven, who's the bailim in the korban, and he starts his avoda with a machshava l'shem Shimon, not l'shem Reuven. Now he continues his avoda l'shem, the other avodas l'shem Reuven. And he quotes the Merkeves HaMishnah, then in such a case, the korban is kosher as if it was shechted l'shma. He had a machshava of shalol l'shma. But now, he got it right. He rectified the situation according to the Merkeves HaMishnah. And instead of chini bailim, he's going to have a machshava in the other avodas l'shem bailim. a different Bailam, not for Shimon, but rather for Reuven, and it's kosher. Okay. Now, a machshava shinui bailam applies to shchita, kabbalah, and olach, not just rika. So if he had a machshava at the time of the shchita that the zrika would be shalol l'shem bailam, that's called a machshava shinui bailam. Ach ein machshava shinui bailam poseles im chishe b'shar avodos sha'osa osam l'shem bailam acher. What does that mean? Chishe b'shchita of shlomim for Reuven shows us a shchita, and he had in mind that the zrika would be l'shem Shimon. That's called a machshava shinui bailam. Chishe b'shchita shall be Reuven shall oses hashchita l'shem Shimon. Ein ze machshava shinui bailam aposelos. So again, you could have a shinui bailam, a machshava shinui bailam aposelos during any of the avodos, but it's got to be related to the zrika. If, for example, the shchita was l'shem bailam acherim, that's not a machshava aposelos. He's got to have a machshava that the shchita should be for the purpose of a zrika l'shem bailam acherim. So it's really fascinating because if he had in mind during the shchita l'shem Shimon, then Reuven is yotze yidei chovasam. He has fulfilled his obligation with this very carbon. It's all bailam l'shem chova. And now we get to the issue that we touched upon in the past of shachat l'shem chulin. I mean, you would say that if you had the wrong zevach, it's called the shinui zevach, and it's a machshava shalol lishma haposelos, that's called shinui kodesh. How much more so if he had in mind the shem chulin? He thinks that he's shechting a bemis chulin. No, it's not so. Ein zu machshava shalol lishma haposelos. Not even in the case of a chatos. And that's a manifestation of a general universal principle called min b'mino posel, but min b'shalom mino eno posel, or eno machri. And once again, it's the same idea in different manifestations, different expressions. It's got to be within the structure. You know, you have in mind for an elephant that's not within the ballpark. Chulin, in comparison to Kodshim, is like an elephant in comparison to a human being. It's a different league. It's not Kodshim, it's Chulin. It's lav mina eno machriv. The machshava aposelos has to be mi'inyan karma, something that could be relevant to the karma, but not chulin, which is not relevant to kodshim. That's what we have so far. However, there are different sugyas about machshavas chulin. In some cases, the Gemara says kshera. With the machshavas chulin, the carbon is kosher. That's a sugya on Daf Gimel. But elsewhere, on Daf Mem Vav, the Gemara says kshera v'eino maratza. There's no ritzui carbon. Well, if there's no ritzui carbon, then you have to replace the carbon with a second carbon. So in the case of machshava l'shem chulin, where the Gemara says kshera v'eino maratza, what it means is it's a kosher carbon. Below all the bailam l'shem chova, the bailam are going to have to bring a replacement carbon. And that's going to be true in the case of a chakas. So we had in mind, in the case of a chakas, l'shem chulin, the carbon is still kosher, but because of min b'sheno mino ein machriv, but he's going to have to bring a replacement chatas, because this chatas was not a chatas, it was l'shem chulin. What about a case of a carbon pesach? If he had in mind that he's doing the avodah of the carbon pesach l'shem chulin, Omnam b'korban pesach shefishev l'shem chulin nifsal hakorban. So this is counterintuitive. We're saying in the case of chatos l'shem chulin, the carbon is kosher, albeit ain't no ola b'ayil l'shem chova, but it's still a kosher carbon. But in the case of carbon pesach l'shem chulin, the carbon is possible. Why should pesach be more chomer than chatos? But the answer is because the entire essence of Korban Pesach is so that the Baal HaKorban could fulfill his obligation and eat the carbon. If you tell me lo ol l'shem chova, it means it has some sort of generic, faceless, anonymous entity. It doesn't have any identity of its own as a Korban Pesach. Then you cannot fulfill your mitzvah with its carbon, and this carbon is 100% dedicated to the purpose, the agenda, the goal of eating a carbon pesach. Let me just see if he adds anything. Tov Samach Zayin in the footnote. Just gives you Mar Makoms and tells you to look in the Keren Orah. I think we have it right, and I hope I'm not misleading anybody here, but I think what he's saying is that in L'Shem Chulin, it's not Ola L'Bayim L'Shem Chova, and in the case of Korban Pesach, that means virtually that the carbon is possible. Because if it's not Ola as a Korban Pesach, give it a generic, faceless name, as a carbon somewhere in the constellation of Zvachim, that's not going to do it in the case of Pesach, because the entire purpose of the Pesach is to fulfill your Al-Gev Abbas B'Layla. And finally, just to end that discussion for today, Shlomim L'Shem Toda, if he had a machshava in the case of a carbon Toda, L'Shem Shlomim, that's not a machshava Shinin Kodesh, because carbon Toda is in fact a subcategory of the generic category called Shlomim. But in the case of a carbon Shlomim, if he had in mind for the specific carbon, so Shlomim is a general category that includes many, many different toldos. It's an Av. But if at the time of the tolda, if at the time of the Av, he had in mind the Shem tolda, that's going to be a machshava poselis. So for example, he has a carbon Shlomim, and he has in mind the Shem toda. That's a machshava Shinin Kodesh, because a carbon toda is called a Shlomim, but it's called Shalmei Toda. It has its own name to it. So you can't say that a Shlomim is called a Toda. You can say that a Toda is called Shlomim. So in the case of a Toda that he had in mind, L'Shem Shlomim, that's not a Machsheva Shinin Kodesh, because Toda in fact is Shlomim, but the reverse is not true. Shlomim is not Toda. I mean, there are many, many different dinim that are unique to the Hakrava, the Avoda of a carbon Toda, as a separate entity that pulls itself out of Shlomim, the generic category. So you could call Toda Shlomim, but you can't call Shlomim. And that's a sugya in Zvachim on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Now again, if let's say you had a Shinui Bailim in the case of Toda, that's a whole different story. Let's say it was Ruvain's carbon Toda, and you had in mind when you did the Avoda L'Shem Toda Shimon, that's already Shinui Bailim. That's an entirely different story. We're talking about Shinui Kodesh, and we're saying that Toda L'Shem Shlomim does not constitute a Shinui Kodesh. So let's just make a note of where we got up to. L'Shem Toda Chavero, which B'lineda we would pick up on Sunday. That's almost the end of Chav Dalet. I don't have a photocopy of Chav Hey, if you have a minute to. Oh, great. You sure you have a copy for yourself? Oh, I thought maybe you're going to learn with us over the Zoom. Okay. But you can listen to the recording at any time you want.
Yeah, I think I can do.
And you can do. I'm not forcing you.